Caught on camera, too brutal to air on TV today, this is the story of a Formula One tragedy so graphic and heartbreaking that official broadcasts won't show it even decades later. An up-and-coming driver and a teenage track marshal lost their lives in a split second on a day that would forever change F1's approach to safety. What unfolded at the 1977 South African Grand Prix was every driver's worst nightmare, and it was all captured on film. In this video, we delve into that chilling incident, how it epitomized the dangers of 1970s F1, and how it forced the sport to finally confront its deadly complacency. Before we begin, if you're passionate about untold F1 stories, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives. We begin with a scene almost too horrifying to describe. It's lap 22 at Kyalami Circuit, 1977. A routine Formula One race is about to turn into an unthinkable disaster. A car stalls with a small fire on the pit straight, and two volunteer marshals dash across the live track carrying fire extinguishers. In the distance, two F1 cars crest a blind rise at over 270 kilometers per hour. One swerves and narrowly misses the marshals. The other doesn't see them until it's too late. The resulting impact is so violent that for years, F1 officials refused to show it on television. Those who were there that day witnessed a nightmare in real time. A nightmare that finally pushed F1 to reform its cavalier attitude towards safety. But how could such a thing happen? To understand, we must travel back to the 1970s, an era when speed often trumped safety, with fatal consequences. The 1970s in Formula One were exhilarating and extremely deadly. By the start of that decade, F1 cars were faster than ever, but safety measures lagged far behind. High-speed crashes were common, and too often they proved fatal. In fact, around 10 drivers lost their lives in F1 during the 1970s alone. To put that in perspective, 15 had been killed in the 1950s and 12 in the 1960s. A grim tally that illustrates how routine tragedy was back then. Fans and drivers arrived at circuits each weekend, knowing that by Sunday evening, there was a very real chance someone might not make it home. Death was practically accepted as part of racing in those days. Drivers were hailed as fearless gladiators, and the notion of slowing down for safety was often dismissed. Jackie Stewart, one of the few voices pushing for better safety, had been trapped in a gasoline-soaked wreck in 1966 with no proper tools around to rescue him. That day, fellow drivers had to stop and pull Stewart from his car because the marshals were so unprepared. They had no cutting equipment, no protective gear, nothing. It was a terrifying wake-up call. Yet in the years that followed, progress was painfully slow. By the 1970s, speeds kept climbing. Big money sponsorships poured in, but the safety infrastructure was still shockingly basic. Flimsy guardrails, minimal medical facilities, and emergency crews that were often just eager volunteers learning on the fly. Every driver in that era had stories of close calls, and tragically, many had stories of friends lost. Yet the show went on. A kind of fatalistic attitude hung over the sport. Drivers loved racing and accepted the risk, and organizers were often reluctant to halt a race even after a serious crash. This was the dangerous world into which a young Welsh driver named Pryce entered, hoping to make his mark. To truly grasp why the 1977 incident was so horrific, you have to understand just how perilous the cars and conditions of the 1970s were. F1 cars of that era were essentially rolling bombs. They carried large fuel loads in fragile tanks, sometimes even made of magnesium and other flammable materials. In a heavy crash, these cars could erupt in flames or literally explode on impact. Drivers sat low in the cockpit, surrounded by fuel on all sides. One racer from the era quipped that you were practically sitting on a bomb every time you revved up the engine. Seatbelts had only become mandatory a few years earlier, and the chassis offered scant protection. It's no exaggeration to say that a bad crash in a 1970s F1 car was often unsurvivable. On top of that, the people tasked with responding to accidents, the track marshals, were frequently under-equipped and undertrained. Many were local volunteers with a passion for racing, but little formal training in safety protocols. Some didn't even have proper fireproof clothing as they stood trackside. Communication was primitive. Marshals often acted on instinct rather than coordination. Jackie Stewart's 1966 crash had proven marshals weren't prepared for worst-case scenarios, and yet similar scenes played out multiple times in the 70s. In the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix, for example, a young driver, Roger Williamson, perished in a fire while a lone fellow driver tried desperately to flip his car upright. Marshals, lacking fireproof suits and clear instructions, hesitated to help in time. The tragedy underscored how ill-prepared track workers were when seconds counted. At many circuits, if a car caught fire, marshals would rush toward the flames with whatever extinguishers they had, often without any signal to oncoming cars. There were supposed policies about how to handle on-track emergencies, but these were inconsistently followed. By 1977, it was still common to see marshals sprint across hot or active racetracks to attend to incidents, a practice that today would be unthinkable. Cars blazing past at over 160 miles per hour and marshals darting between them with fire gear. It was a recipe for disaster. And at Kyalami on March 5, 1977, that disaster finally happened in the most horrific way imaginable. Tom Pryce was no ordinary driver. By early 1977, the 27-year-old from Wales had earned a reputation as one of one's brightest rising stars. He was especially known as a wet weather specialist, a driver who could do magic in the rain when others tiptoed. In 1975, at a rain-soaked Austrian Grand Prix, Pryce deftly kept his car on track while many rivals spun out, and he clinched a podium finish, third place in treacherous conditions, ahead of world champions like Niki Lauda and Emerson Fittipaldi. That same year, he won the Race of Champions, a non-championship F1 event, at Brands Hatch, beating big names in equal machinery. People in the paddock took notice. This Welsh kid had serious talent. By 1976, Tom had secured another podium, third in Brazil, and even grabbed a pole position in Britain. He was driving for the modest Shadow Racing team, which wasn't a front-runner outfit, yet Pryce often muscled their car into places it didn't belong. His car control was superb, especially when the track was wet or slippery. The great John Watson later remarked that Tom's natural ability was above and beyond that of his contemporaries. In fact, Team Lotus, the reigning champions, were so impressed with Pryce that they considered signing him to partner Mario Andretti for 1978, even if it meant letting go of the legendary Ronnie Peterson. That deal ultimately fell through, but the mere fact it was on the table shows how highly rated Pryce was. Many believe that with the right car, Tom Pryce could be Britain's next Formula One champion. Off track, Tom was quiet and unassuming, beloved by his team and fans. Hailing from a small town in Wales, he hadn't grown up wealthy or connected. He trained as a tractor mechanic before racing cars. His humble beginnings and dazzling talent made him a fan favorite. By the start of the 1977 season, Pryce was itching for a breakthrough. Little did anyone know he was about to make headlines around the world, but for the worst possible reason. The 1977 South African Grand Prix at Kyalami was the third race of that F1 season. Pryce's Shadow team was struggling financially, but Tom was still squeezing performances out of the car. In the previous race in Brazil, he had run as high as second place before a blown engine robbed him of a sure podium just a few laps from the finish. Despite the setback, Pryce arrived at Kyalami with momentum and confidence. He even set the fastest time in one of the wet practice sessions earlier in the week, further proof of his prowess in tricky conditions. Kyalami Circuit itself was a fast, challenging track near Johannesburg. At over 6,000 feet altitude, the thin air sapped engine power, but the long straights still saw F1 cars topping 170 miles per hour. The main straight in front of the pits was particularly daunting. It crested a hill about halfway down, meaning drivers coming over the rise couldn't see what lay ahead on the latter part of the straight. This blind crest would prove fateful. Pryce qualified a so-so 15th on the grid. Not ideal, but he was in the mix. As the race started, he steadily gained a few positions, running in the midfield and battling hard as always. By lap 21, Tom was chasing German driver Hans-Joachim Stuck in a fight through the pack. Up ahead of them, however, trouble was brewing. Tom's rookie teammate at Shadow, Renzo Zorzi, had pulled off to the side of the main straight with an engine problem that caused a fuel leak. Fuel spilt onto Zorzi's hot engine, and a small fire ignited at the back of his car. Zorzi managed to park on the grass just past the crest of the hill and was struggling to disconnect his helmet's oxygen tube so he could exit the car. A bit of smoke was visible. Nothing huge, but certainly a fire that needed attending. This is where the lack of protocol kicked in. Two marshals on the pit side saw Zorzi's car smoking, and without hesitating, grabbed fire extinguishers and sprinted across the track. They did not wait for an official pause in the race or for race control's permission. They just reacted, likely fearing the car might burst into a bigger flame. One marshal was 25-year-old Bill, and the other was 19-year-old Frederik "Frikkie" Jansen van Vuuren, who hefted a 40-pound fire extinguisher in his arms as he ran. Neither of them seemed aware that at that very moment, multiple F1 cars were barreling down the straight at top speed, about to come over the blind rise. The scene was set for disaster. It was now lap 22, and Tom Pryce and Hans Stuck were charging side by side down the main straight, obscured from the marshals by that crest. The crowd in the grandstands could see what was about to happen before the drivers did. A collective gasp went up as they watched two brave but foolish marshals dash into the path of oncoming cars. In the blink of an eye, the fates of Tom Pryce and Jansen van Vuuren would collide. What happened next unfolded in a heartbeat. Hans-Joachim Stuck, leading the small pack with Pryce right behind, suddenly spotted something moving on the track, a marshal directly in his path. As we got to the top, I suddenly sensed this marshal running across, carrying an extinguisher, Stuck later recalled. I took a big chance. I just reacted on pure instinct. Stuck swerved hard to the right at the very last possible second, narrowly missing both marshals by mere inches. It was so close that Stuck himself couldn't believe he hadn't hit someone. But Tom Pryce, following immediately behind in Stuck's slipstream, had no time and no visibility. Stuck's sudden dodge meant that Tom had even less chance to see the young man now directly in his path. In an instant that no driver could have prevented, Pryce's shadow car plowed into Marshal Jansen van Vuuren at roughly 170 miles per hour. The impact was unimaginably violent. Van Vuuren's body was hit with such force that it was torn apart. He was killed instantly, so instantly that he likely never even saw the car that struck him. The young marshal was literally launched into the air and came down yards away near the stopped Zorzi car. Spectators and crew members looked on in sheer horror as debris and, tragically, body parts scattered across the track. But the tragedy did not end there. Van Vuuren had been carrying a 40-pound metal fire extinguisher, and that heavy cylinder became a deadly projectile. In a cruel twist of fate, the extinguisher slammed directly into Tom Pryce as it flipped through the air. It struck him squarely on the helmet at immense speed, likely on the chin area of his helmet, with an impact so ferocious that it wrenched his helmet clean off his head. The force was equivalent to being hit by a cannonball. Tom Pryce was killed instantly by that blow. The extinguisher's impact was so extreme that it nearly decapitated him. The chin strap of his helmet partially severed his neck due to the force. In one fraction of a second, 2 lives were extinguished. Pryce's car, now essentially a missile with no living driver controlling it, continued hurtling down toward the first corner. His lifeless feet likely jammed the throttle open because the shadow didn't slow much at all. It veered slightly to the right, scraping along a barrier, and then smashed into the Ligier of driver Jacques Lafitte at the end of the straight. Lafitte, who was braking for the corner, had no idea what had just happened behind him. He felt a thud as Pryce's car hit him, and both cars careened off into a barrier. Lafitte, angry at having his race ended, leapt out of his damaged Ligier and stormed toward Pryce's car, presumably to confront him for the collision. What Lafitte saw when he reached the shadow immediately turned his anger to shock and despair. Tom Pryce was slumped motionless in the cockpit, his helmet gone, and it was obvious that something was terribly wrong. Only then did Jacques notice the horrifying carnage on the track behind and realize the full scale of the tragedy. The gruesome incident lasted only a second or two, and many in attendance could scarcely believe what they had witnessed. It was arguably the most graphic accident in Formula One history, all caught by trackside cameras. F1's TV directors quickly cut away. This was something no one wanted to broadcast explicitly. Seasoned racing reporters were left shaken. In the pits, team members and officials stared at each other in stunned silence. Had 2 people really just been killed right in front of them? Chaos and confusion reigned in the immediate aftermath. The red flag to stop the race was not thrown right away. In 1977, it was still common to keep racing unless a crash completely blocked the track. Some drivers and spectators didn't even realize a fatal accident had occurred. because Pryce's car had continued down to the next turn. A few thought maybe a wheel or debris had bounced up, but those near the pit straight knew the horrific truth. Marshals and medics rushed to the scenes, to Van Vuuren's horribly impacted body on the track, and to Pryce's wrecked car down at Crowthorne Corner. There was nothing to be done for either of them. Frederik Jansen Van Vuuren's injuries were so severe that officials couldn't immediately identify which marshal he was. His body was unrecognizable. In fact, the only way they confirmed it was him was by doing a roll call of all the volunteer marshals and realizing he was the one missing. It was a heartbreaking task. This enthusiastic 19-year-old, who had volunteered to help make his beloved sport safer, had paid the ultimate price in a most horrifying manner. At Pryce's car, the scene was equally upsetting. Tom's helmet had been knocked off by the extinguisher's impact, and one of the first people to reach him, a brave marshal or perhaps driver Lafitte, saw immediately that Tom was beyond saving. The cockpit was spattered with blood. Despite the devastation, track workers carefully removed Pryce's body from the car, covering him with a sheet. A photograph later showed his helmet lying on the track, visibly damaged and bloodied, a haunting image that symbolized the brutal nature of the crash. Officials eventually stopped the race for a time, then decided to restart and run the remaining laps after the wreckage was cleared. Such was the mentality of the era. The show must go on, even on a day like this. Many spectators were in shock, unsure how to react. Some had tears in their eyes. Others sat in numb silence at the grandstands. Meanwhile, news spread through the paddock that Tom Pryce and a young marshal were dead. Pryce's team, Shadow Racing, was devastated. His wife Fenella, who often attended races, had to be informed of the unimaginable. On the podium after the race, which was eventually won by Niki Lauda, there was a somber mood. Lauda initially was celebrating what he thought was a hard-fought victory, but upon being told why the ceremony was delayed and what had happened on lap 22, his face fell. There was no joy after that, Lauda said of the win. An eerie pall hung over Kyalami Circuit that afternoon. What fans had witnessed was something no one should have to see at a sporting event. It was more akin to a battlefield scene than a motor race. The television broadcasters in many countries chose not to replay the fatal impact. It was deemed too graphic, too distressing. For years, only fragments of the footage surfaced, often censored. In the modern day, clips exist on the internet, but with content warnings, it's truly that horrific. F1 had learned a hard lesson in blood on that day, even if they didn't fully admit it yet. Something had to change. One person who had perhaps the closest view of the tragedy was Renzo Zorzi, the very driver whose minor fire inadvertently set the whole nightmare in motion. Zorzi had managed to scramble out of his shadow car on the side of the track just seconds before the accident. He turned around and witnessed a sight no driver ever wants to see: a fellow competitor's car flying past with debris and a body in the air. In the chaotic moments after, Zorzi himself was in shock. He reportedly ran toward Pryce's stricken car to help, only to be greeted by an awful scene. Years later, in a 2014 interview, Renzo Zorzi opened up about that day. The Italian recalled how he walked toward Tom Pryce's stopped car and noticed something on the ground: Pryce's helmet. It had been torn off by the impact and was lying askew on the tarmac. Zorzi could see inside the helmet and realized it was filled with blood. That horrifying image is something he said stayed with him forever. "I can still see it," Zorzi said, describing the blood-soaked helmet and the lifeless form of the driver who had been his teammate only moments before. For Zorzi, this was a turning point. He confessed that after witnessing the true brutality of racing's dangers, he lost much of his desire to continue in Formula One. He kept racing a bit in the aftermath. He did 2 more Grand Prix events, but his heart was no longer in it. By the time the F1 circus reached Monaco a few months later in 1977, Zorzi had quietly been replaced and would never race in Formula One again. In that 2014 reflection, Renzo admitted that Pryce's death had sapped his motivation. How could he continue knowing what he'd seen? The sport had exacted a toll on his soul. It's worth noting that, at the time, some unfairly blamed Zorzi for the accident, suggesting that his frantic signaling and struggle with the car made the marshals act hastily. This added to Zorzi's trauma. He felt guilt, though truly the fault lay in F1's flawed safety protocols, not in the actions of a distraught young driver escaping a burning car. Renzo Zorzi's first-hand account is a sobering reminder. The drivers and marshals are human, and such an ordeal left deep psychological scars. Zorzi would go on to live until 2015, always remembered as the man who was involved, however innocently, in one of F1's darkest days. He carried the memory of Tom Pryce's final moments with him for the rest of his life. To truly understand the mentality of the 1970s, consider the story of Ignazio Giunti. Giunti was an Italian driver for Ferrari, a promising talent. In September 1970, Giunti appeared on a TV show just after the death of Jochen Rindt, who had been killed in a crash at Monza that very weekend. The host asked Giunti about the dangers of racing, perhaps trying to reassure the audience, and maybe himself. Ignazio Giunti boldly claimed that modern racing was quite safe now. He said that racing had become very professional, that circuits were getting safer all the time. Giunti even gave an example. If the guardrail that Rindt hit had been a bit stronger, Rindt would have walked away without a scratch, he argued. He rejected the idea that drivers were reckless. To Giunti, Formula One had reached a level of precision and safety where skill and technology could protect them from the worst. It was a chillingly ironic statement. Just a few months later, in January 1971, Ignazio Giunti himself was killed in a horrific racing accident. While leading a sports car race in Buenos Aires, Giunti slammed into a stranded car on track, and his Ferrari burst into flames, killing him. The very man who had confidently stated on television that the races today are pretty safe became another casualty of the era's perils. His optimistic words on safety were tragically disproven so soon after he spoke them. Giunti's story highlights how normalized the danger was in that era. Even drivers, the ones who stared death in the face at 180 miles per hour, sometimes convinced themselves that the worst wouldn't happen to them. They had to, perhaps, to carry on. When Giunti said, "Races today are quite safe, circuits are becoming safer and safer." It was just weeks after one world champion had died, and only weeks before another rising star, himself, would die. Such was the paradox of 1970s Formula One. Everyone knew the risks were deadly, yet they often spoke as if safety was improving enough that fatal crashes were just freak occurrences. In truth, lethal accidents were still around the corner, lurking at every Grand Prix. The deaths of drivers like Giunti, and later Pryce, were met with a grim resignation as much as outrage. There would be momentary clamor for change, but then the next race would come, and the spectacle continued. It took an accumulation of tragedies and some truly gut-wrenching scenes to finally force a cultural shift in the sport's approach to safety. The double fatality of Tom Pryce and Frederik Vuuren in 1977 sent shockwaves through Formula One. It was clear something had gone terribly wrong in terms of procedure. In the aftermath, the FIA, the sport's governing body, conducted a thorough review of marshalling procedures. No one wanted to ever see a track worker put in such peril again. Rules were gradually tightened. Marshals were forbidden from crossing a live track without explicit permission from race control, no matter how urgent the situation. The idea was simple. You don't send people in front of speeding cars unless those cars have been slowed or stopped. This eventually led to better use of safety cars and red flags to neutralize races when an accident happens, so marshals can intervene more safely. It must be said, change didn't come overnight. The late 70s and early 80s still saw fatal crashes. For example, Ronnie Peterson in 1978, Gilles Villeneuve in 1982, which further spurred improvements. But slowly and surely, Formula One made cars and tracks safer. By the end of the 1970s, fireproof racing suits, gloves, and underwear were standard. Drivers were required to wear multi-layer Nomex gear that could resist flames far longer, a lesson learned from fiery accidents. High padded cockpits and 6-point safety harnesses started to appear, keeping drivers more secure in crashes. Fuel tank technology was improved dramatically. Those rolling bombs were replaced by puncture-resistant fuel cells by the early 80s, greatly reducing the chance of an explosion on impact. Hazardous materials like magnesium, which burns fiercely, were phased out of car construction. Onboard fire extinguishers became mandatory. Ironically, Pryce's car did have one, which Zorzi activated, but unfortunately, external help was still sought too soon. The protocols for track marshals saw a big overhaul. Training became more professional. Marshals were taught to never act alone and to always coordinate with race control. What happened at Kyalami, marshals running across a hot track, was now clearly identified as a huge no-no. In the future, if a car was on fire on the opposite side, race directors would ideally throw a caution period, nowadays a safety car or virtual safety car, to slow down the pack before marshals attend. It took time to implement these procedures globally, but the change was set in motion. The tragedy led to a thorough review of marshalling procedures as part of F1's constant drive to improve safety. In addition, F1 started to have better medical presence on site. The late Professor Sid Watkins, a neurosurgeon, was brought in around 1978 as the official F1 doctor, ensuring rapid medical response. A direct response to crashes like Pryce's and others, where immediate care could mean life or death. A medical car began following the pack on the first lap of races, so that a doctor would be on the scene of a first-lap crash within seconds. All these were pieces of a puzzle aimed at preventing a repeat of that Black Day in South Africa. Still, progress was incremental. Old attitudes died hard. Some insiders resisted safety measures, fearing they'd dilute the sport. But the stark horror of incidents like Pryce's made it increasingly difficult to justify the old ways. By the 1980s, the results of safety improvements started to show. The number of driver fatalities dropped significantly compared to the 60s and 70s. In the 1980s, 4 F1 drivers lost their lives, and in the 1990s, 2. The infamous Imola 1994 weekend, still too many, but a marked improvement from the bloodbath of prior decades. Marshals, too, faced less risk, though there were still rare tragic accidents. The type of calamity that struck Van Vuuren became virtually unheard of in Formula One. It's heartbreaking that it took death to spur change, but that is often the story of safety regulation in motorsport. Every rule in the book, they say, is written in blood. Pryce and Van Vuuren's deaths were not in vain. They forced F1 to confront how unacceptable it was to have anyone, driver or marshal, die in such a preventable way. Over time, their accident has become a case study for race organizers on exactly what not to do when a car is in trouble on track. No piece of safety equipment, no protocol change can bring back the lives lost, but they can honor those lives by preventing others from suffering the same fate. To this day, the accident of Tom Pryce and Frederik Van Vuuren stands as one of Formula One's most horrifying moments. It is often left unspoken by the sport's official history. You won't see it in F1's highlight reels or anniversary montages. In a way, F1 wants you to forget this tragedy because of how gruesome and discomforting it is. It's much easier to celebrate the glories of the past than to confront the fact that a teenage volunteer was literally torn apart on a sunny afternoon Grand Prix. But as fans and custodians of the sport's history, we should remember. We must remember Tom Pryce, the only Welshman to lead a Grand Prix and a man of immense promise, and Frederik Van Vuuren, the young fan-turned-marshal who gave his life trying to help a driver. Their story, as awful as it is, led to changes that have undoubtedly saved lives in the years since. Today, Formula One is far safer than it was in 1977. Fatalities in top-tier motorsport have become rare, almost unheard of, a fact that would have seemed like a fantasy to drivers of Pryce's era. Every time we see a driver walk away from a huge crash, or we see marshals handling an incident with well-drilled precision and safety cars neutralizing the pack, we are seeing the legacy of the hard lessons learned from tragedies like this. The next time you hear someone complain that modern F1 is too safe or has too many red flags, remember why those red flags exist. They exist so that no family has to endure what the Pryce and Van Vuuren families did. In the end, Tom Pryce and Frederik Van Vuuren's fatal encounter forced Formula One to grow up and value safety as much as speed. It's a somber legacy, but an important one. The sport, and all of us who love it, owe it to them to never forget what happened and to never become complacent again. If you found this deep dive important or informative, please give the video a thumbs up and share it with other F1 fans. These lessons of the past deserve to be known. And subscribe for more stories that honor the history of motorsport, both the triumphant and the tragic. As we reflect on that dark day at Kyalami, one final unsettling question lingers. If it wasn't caught on camera, would they have even changed?